Victoria 3 gameplay returns today as we take a whirlwind look around the world in Paradox's up-and-coming grand strategy game. We'll be looking at some of the in-game events, laws, civics, and tech trees, delving into those mechanics. We'll also take a look at what happens when things don't quite go to plan, when authority falls to the wayside. And that will, of course, surmount in some Japan versus Japan military action. One of the elements in Victoria 3 that interests many players. I'll be using some footage kindly supplied by the devs themselves, the game director and content design lead from Victoria 3. They recently live streamed 3 hours and 8 minutes worth of gameplay footage, and if you don't have the time to sit through it, although I would highly recommend you do, and of course it will be linked below because I'm reflecting and analyzing it in this video, I will now provide to you a super cut version of the Victoria 3 footage. This is part 2, part 1 already on the channel. Let's begin. There'll be time cards below so you can bounce around, but in a nutshell, for the first minute or two now, I'll talk about this gameplay in particular and the key facts that you need to know about Victoria 3. We will, of course, be playing in the wonderful Japan, and then moving through into the meat, the second or third part of this video, I'll be talking about some key updates that are coming to Victoria 3 that we learned from the most recent developer diaries for the Victoria 3, and a little bit of what I've managed to glean out of this gameplay. Speaking of course, we are playing as Japan. We are playing around the sort of earlier parts of the game. Victoria 3 is set from 1836 through until around 1936, that key 100-year Victorian period, go figure. It is, of course, a grand strategy game coming from Paradox Interactive, studio behind the likes of Hearts of Iron 4 and Crusader Kings 3. I mentioned those two in particular because if you've played them and you've watched some Victoria 3 footage, potentially, you'll notice that some of the features and elements from those games have been brought into this Victoria 3. Of course, the now 12-year in the making game. I don't actually know if it was developed that whole time, but what I'm referencing here is, of course, that Victoria 2 came out some 12 years ago. In this footage, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to see a little bit more of military action in Victoria 3. One of the mechanics that is a little more hands-off than in other titles, particularly if we're reflecting on something like potentially Hearts of Iron 4, maybe Stellaris, that kind of thing. In Victoria 3, we're more interested, perhaps, in the actual running of the state, how we interact with other states, trade, logistics, building up our nation, and of course, that's supported by surrounding features of military, etc., etc. Let's move through now and talk about the more recent updates to Victoria 3, on how they're bringing some of these mechanics and criticism that has already mounted on the game, and hopefully making some changes. I'll let you be the judge on whether they're good or bad. My opinion is that they seem to be pretty good, though. Let's take a look. One of the key changes, in fact, the big thing, was this screenshot, actually, involving this array of flags. But don't be overwhelmed. It's a mechanic called interests, and if you didn't watch part 1, really quickly, interests is essentially your diplomatic presence, how you interact with and engage with other nations. They can trigger it with you, you can trigger it with them. It's very important, of course, because Victoria 3 spans literally the entire world. So this is very much a geopolitical game and a geopolitical beast. So how you interact with other places is a lot more important than potentially in something like Civilization 6, where we might establish an embassy, right? This is very much taking that basic idea and pumping it up full of life. Now, the interest system itself, though, has, like some other systems in this game, particularly looking at potentially something like the military, been criticized a bit, and some weaknesses have already emerged. Interests had really two key ways of being formed previously, and they were largely really only used for starting diplomatic plays or establishing colonies. They kind of, in many ways, acted as a guide for the AI on how it should sort of be heralded through to carry out those processes. This is how I understand it from reading through the dev diary anyway. There were, of course, a few issues that emerged with that system that was perhaps a little bit basic or rudimentary for what it needed to be. Firstly, it was largely really only used for those two things, establishing colonies. And secondly, more importantly, it was limited to rank, the in-game rank of your country. This created some issues, though, because if you think about Europe and that screenshot that I threw up before, with all of those different countries vying for diplomatic interest and building relationships, engagements, whether they're positive or negative, with one another, and a lot of high-ranking countries in terms of global sway, positioning, power, significance in this colonial era. This creates some problems and tensions, though, and the example they gave in the dev diary is a fantastic one. Think about Austria versus England and their stance in the world. two powerful, perhaps significant players in geopolitics in Europe. They therefore have a relatively high rank and access to a lot of diplomatic plays. The difficulty here was that while that might be fitting in Europe, in continental Europe, when you look further afield and compare England, the British Empire, to Austria, which one of those places should have more diplomatic sway, more interests or presence in overseas territories? Here's looking at you, Oceania, the Americas, the list goes on. The answer is fairly obvious. If you're familiar with history, it should be Britain, not Austria. Think about that navy. So, how do you get around this then? What have the devs decided to do to work through this issue where essentially the diplomatic engagements in that web of diplomacy isn't quite working properly? The solution they've taken in this case was to route it more through naval bases and the sea, and therefore the military, of course. The Navy is a very important part of your military presence in Victoria 3, or at least it ought to be, because it also interacts with trade. They've looped it through that, reduced the power of rank, and added a few sprinklings over top. And I think it should produce a better system. This is how it plays out. While a nation like some of the green ones on our right might look to form an alliance with Britain or a European power, they may be unable to do it purely because they don't share a border. That is absolutely the way it's intended, unless, of course, they have a wonderful military presence through these naval bases, these new work-in-progress, redeveloped naval bases that will have more of a significance in Victoria 3. Might be fitting for an isolationist, may become not isolationist state like the shogunate Japan that we're playing as right now. Mechanically, and to put it simply, the changes are a little more clear-cut. No diplomats in a foreign land and no engagement with it, then you have no ability to conduct any form of diplomacy there, the way it should probably be intended, because of course you can't just whip out your iPhone 14 and send a text to Vietnam. Secondly, and more importantly, how the gameplay mechanics themselves have been tweaked. Naval bases now produce declared interest. Very important. Secondly, the rank interests have been overall slightly nerfed. Those two balancing features should hopefully make for a more organic and, crucially, as they argue in the developer's diary, a much more important system out of the interests, because you are literally prohibited from engaging with these people, with these foreign powers, unless you have declared interest not only that you can form, but also maintain. And presented truly in no particular order, how does this interest, this global geopolitical interest system actually work? Here you can see the four key parts of how this new system will play out. Firstly, diplomatic plays and colonization. Just as before, a country, whether it's the one you control or, don't forget, all of this applies to the AI as well, must have an interest in a region to start a diplomatic play or begin colonizing there. No connection, no diplomats, no shared interest, no way for you to play. Secondly, diplomatic actions. To conduct diplomacy with another country, you must have at least one overlapping interest, those things that we talked about earlier. So you must have an interest in any strategic region that they also have a shared interest. Maybe you've got your eyes on that, probably not quite uranium, but maybe that iron's looking particularly juicy. The example that they gave in the dev diary was Texas can conduct diplomacy with Britain if Britain maintains an interest in the Dixie region, even if Texas has no interests outside of that region. So while it's a very complicated and overarching system, there are absolutely ways for, I'm sure, or at least I hope, loads of different nations and states and interests to engage with one another. Thirdly, and this is now where we start to get maybe into some more revamped and more interesting things, because this is how interests relate with perhaps combat or, of course, making money, trade. To establish a trade route within markets, one of the owners has to have an interest in any region where the other market is present. So I have to have an interest in Canada as the US in order to trade with them, for example. In the developer's diary, they maybe gave a slightly more fitting one. I just couldn't resist while we were panning around the world there to drop a shout out for the mighty US of A, who are, of course, incredibly interested and interconnected in this world, although perhaps lesser in the start than they will be towards the end of a Victoria 3 session. Either way, the US can trade with Argentina, providing that they have a shared interest within a mutually interesting region. Just important to note, another sort of anecdotal example of how the system is quite an interrelated and complex web. You may not completely be isolated because you may have shared interests with great powers in other foreign regions. So it's important to bear in mind that that overlap is useful and helpful. Now, outside of trade, and notably with very few specific mentions on any involvement of military or combat units here, we've also learned about notifications. And this one is kind of, in a way, like spying and espionage, but on a slightly simpler level. We will only know about the diplomatic doings, whether they're wrongdoings or simple, pleasantries going on between countries unless we have an overlapping interest with them. That's our only way to know what's going on. We need overlapping interest in states where they have an interest in our region, or we share it over a neutral one. Without going over interests too much more, the important thing to note here is that it enables, hopefully, a more organic way of play. An isolated state, somewhere buried up away in the mountains, or maybe you, like me, live in a very faraway island in the Pacific, will truly feel isolated, except for, perhaps, where they share interests with overlapping colonial or world powers. It makes for, hopefully, a more organic system, and by overlapping the involvement of particularly those naval yards and removing a little bit of power from the overall ranking of a country, we should see a system that better reflects geopolitical diplomacy as well. With the empire in tatters, it would be fair to say, let's move through and talk about some abnormally popular discussion on Reddit around expectations for the AI in Victoria 3. The reason why I bring this up is not just because I randomly plucked an article out of Reddit, but because developer diary update number 59 will be all about changes, updates, and the AI in Victoria 3. And while it will probably be a fairly enjoyable multiplayer experience, here's hoping, I imagine a lot of you will be playing this in single player. At least I will be if I reflect on my own experience. And so the AI becomes very, very, very important. And while there is some ironing out that can be done through features, I'm sure, like interests, for example, and some of the things that we just discussed around rank and that kind of thing, the fundamental core will be whether the AI is competitive or not. I can only imagine that an AI for this game at this level of grand strategy and complexity is probably just that. Pretty grand and pretty complex. And to expect perfection is not something that I would condone. However, we do know a little bit more, not just about changes to the AI, but also some broader announcements. So at the last couple of minutes of this video, I want to take you through the quick and dirty everything you need to know about Victoria 3, what's coming in the next update, and when, of course, that game will land in our pockets. And I can answer that last part easily if you didn't hear me at the start of the video. Victoria 3 has a release date of the 25th of October 2022. It is no longer, I believe, coming to Game Pass for PC on day one, but it will be releasing on Steam, and it looks to be releasing just slightly less than what you might expect from a AAA title at around $50 for the base version. Now, that information out of the way, because there will always be a couple of commenters who ask, let's talk about AI. The next developer diary, which is due out in but a couple of days, will be covering off more on that. I will maybe make a video about it if there's enough content and it seems interesting enough. I'll see what they tell us. But from reading the discussion and reflecting on my own impressions of the game, there does seem to be some fear around the AI being able to handle the true complexity of not running a country into a ground, defending itself, engaging in trade, and building up those interests, those crucial diplomatic interests that unlock so much more of the game's potential for particularly some more isolationist or geographically obscure states, shall we say. I would note that if we look at some of their other works, Stellaris, Crusader Kings 3, potentially EU4 as well, the AI does see some very solid improvements. A little after the game is released, though. It does tend to take a bit of time, like most strategy games, to really iron out the kinks and improve it. However, we also know that they're working with some new back-end engine-like systems and software and all sorts of stuff that's far too complicated for me. But we do know that Victoria 3 is a little bit more built from the ground up in comparison to what Victoria 2, 12 years ago, released on and was built on. So we should expect changes here. Thank you very much for watching this Victoria 3 Japan gameplay, while we also took a look around the rest of the world and the map. Look at the British Raj here, for example. I do intend to cover a bit more Victoria 3. It's a game that's very much captured my interest, and hopefully it's at least captured yours too. Positive, negative, neutral, or otherwise. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.